Have you ever wondered why the foundational story of human creation, the very narrative that shaped civilizations and defined how half of humanity sees itself, has been locked behind a mistranslation so complete, so deliberate, that even today most people accept the distorted version as absolute truth? The story begins not in ancient monasteries or scholarly chambers, but in the deep recesses of language itself, where a single Hebrew word carries the power to either liberate or confine entire generations of consciousness. When you understand what the Ethiopian Bible has preserved through millennia, when you grasp the profound psychological implications that Carl Jung himself recognized in the architecture of human wholeness, you will realize that everything you thought you knew about Eve, about Adam, about the divine creation of humanity, has been filtered through layers of translation that served specific cultural agendas rather than spiritual truth. This revelation is not about biblical scholarship alone. It is about the very foundation of how you relate to yourself, to the other half of humanity, to your own inner divisions and the possibility of wholeness. If you are seeking to understand the deeper layers of your psyche, to integrate the fragmented parts of yourself that society has taught you to hide or suppress, then subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you can follow this journey of discovery as we explore how ancient wisdom, psychological insight, and spiritual integration converge in ways that modern consciousness has forgotten. In the pinned comment below, you will find resources that connect Jung's concept of individuation with the recovery of this sacred geometry of creation, a series we are building specifically to help you understand your own path toward wholeness. Now, as we were saying, let us return to the fundamental question that has haunted human culture for 2,000 years. The word is Selah. 4 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and yet this single term has orchestrated one of history's most consequential mistranslations. When you examine the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, with genuine scholarly attention, you discover something remarkable. In 99% of its uses, Selah refers to a side, a flank, a structural component that bears weight and defines form. When the ancient text describes the Ark of the Covenant in Exodus 25, it speaks of the sides of the Ark, not ribs. These are not small bones. They are the load-bearing dimensions of a sacred vessel. When the prophet Ezekiel witnesses the celestial temple in chapter 41, he sees the sides, the Selah, of that heavenly structure, massive architectural elements that support and define the entire sacred geometry. This is the consistent meaning throughout the Hebrew scriptures. Selah denotes something fundamental, something that gives form and bearing, something that carries the weight of existence. Yet when modern translations arrive at Genesis 2, when the narrative reaches the creation of Eve, something shifts. The translation suddenly narrows. The full architectural meaning of Selah collapses into a single bone, a rib. This is not an accident of translation. It is a choice laden with consequences. The question becomes, why? Why would translators across centuries consistently render this one word differently when it describes the creation of woman, while maintaining the original meaning in every other biblical context? The answer lies in history, in power, and in how language shapes consciousness itself. When the Septuagint was created in Greek over 2,000 years ago, the translators faced a choice between plura, a word that could mean both side and rib, depending on context. They chose a meaning that could be narrowed. Then came the Latin Vulgate, that monumental translation by Jerome in the 4th century, and here the deliberate narrowing accelerated. He selected costa, leaning the meaning decisively toward rib, toward bone, toward something small and removable and secondary. For 15 centuries, the Western Christian world accepted this translation, building theology upon it, creating entire systems of thought and social hierarchy on the foundation of this single linguistic choice. But there is another version of the Bible that never forgot the original meaning. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where Christian monks preserved some of the most ancient manuscripts of faith, where the spiritual lineage maintained an unbroken connection to early Christian tradition, the word Selah retained its full meaning. The Ethiopian Bible speaks not of a rib, but of a side, of the complete flank of Adam, of his other half, of the full dimension of his being that was taken and transformed into Eve. Imagine for a moment the scene as it should be understood. Adam exists in the Garden of Eden in a state of primordial wholeness. The Hebrew text tells you this in Genesis 1:27, where it says God created humanity in the divine image, male and female. But this is chapter 1. Eve has not yet been separated as an individual. The text speaks of Adam as containing both genders, both the masculine and feminine principles in unified wholeness. He is complete. He is whole. He contains within himself the fullness of human expression. Then in chapter 2, something transforms. God causes Adam to fall into a deep sleep, not a light anesthesia for a surgical procedure, but a profound unconsciousness, a death of consciousness, a return to the void. This is not presented as a minor extraction. What happens next is a division, a separation, a tearing apart of the unified whole. God takes one complete side of Adam, one half of his being in its entirety, and from this side, God constructs Eve. The Hebrew doesn't say God fashions Eve from a tiny bone. It says God builds Eve, structures her, creates her as an architectural being from the complete flank of Adam's existence. When Adam awakens and sees Eve, his response is one of profound recognition. He says, "This is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." But here is what most readers miss. This is not language of possession or subordination. This is the language of recognition, of seeing oneself reflected in another, of encountering the lost part of one's own being. Adam looks at Eve and understands that she is not created from him in the sense of being derived from him as something separate and inferior. Rather, she is recognized as himself, as the other manifestation of his own unified nature. She is his counterpart, his mirror, his missing self made visible. This is the Jungian concept of the anima and animus, the inner masculine and feminine that exist within each psyche, sometimes called the shadow, sometimes called the self. What Adam experiences in that moment of awakening is the encounter with his own psychic wholeness, made manifest in another being. Carl Jung understood something that generations of biblical interpretation had obscured. He recognized that the psyche is not a singular, unified thing operating from one principle. The psyche is inherently dual, inherently containing opposites, inherently requiring integration of masculine and feminine principles for psychological health and spiritual development. For Jung, the process of individuation, the psychological journey toward becoming whole, toward becoming fully yourself, requires the integration of the shadow, of all the parts of yourself that society has trained you to hide or deny. The masculine principle in psychology, which Jung associated with consciousness, rationality, logos, the ordering principle, the penetrating force, this is not something men possess and women lack. It exists in both, though cultural conditioning has taught women to suppress it and men to exaggerate it. Similarly, the feminine principle, what Jung called the anima in men and the feminine self in women, represents the receptive, the intuitive, the connecting force, the relational, the mythic wisdom. This too exists in all humans, though patriarchal cultures have systematically trained men to fear it and women to over-identify with it. When the Hebrew text speaks of Adam as containing both male and female in unified wholeness, it is speaking in the language of Jungian psychology centuries before Jung. It is saying that human consciousness, at its origin, was not split. It was whole. It contained both principles in balance. Then comes the separation, the sleep, the division. And here is where the psychological meaning deepens dramatically. The separation of Eve from Adam is not a fall into division. It is the beginning of the psychological journey that will require you to spend your entire life seeking reintegration. This is the hero's journey. This is the path of individuation. You are born into separation. Your consciousness is split between masculine and feminine, between ego and shadow, between the known self and the hidden self. The entire spiritual path, the entire psychological journey of maturation, consists of recognizing these divided parts and bringing them back into relationship, into dialogue, into eventual integration. But here is where spirituality has often failed modern consciousness. Many spiritual traditions, particularly in the ascetic branches of Christianity and Buddhism, have taught that the path to enlightenment requires the rejection of the body, the denial of sexuality, the suppression of desire itself. The feminine principle, with its association with body, with earth, with sensuality, with desire, has been cast as an obstacle to spiritual development rather than an essential component of it. This is the wound that has split Western consciousness for centuries. You are taught to see your body as opposed to your spirit. You are taught to see desire as opposed to devotion. You are taught to see sexuality as opposed to holiness. But what if this entire dichotomy is false? What if the split itself is the illness, and the path to healing is not further separation, but profound integration? This is where the Ethiopian Bible's preservation of the full meaning of Selah becomes spiritually revolutionary. When you understand that Eve was created not from a throwaway bone, but from the full side of Adam, from his complete other half, you begin to see that the division of masculine and feminine is not a diminishment, but a necessary unfolding. It is not a fall, but a becoming. The creation of woman from man's side is not woman being derived from man in a hierarchical sense. It is the differentiation of originally undivided consciousness into two complementary poles that must learn to recognize and reintegrate with each other. In your own psychology, this plays out as the constant tension between your conscious ego and your shadow, the parts of yourself you have hidden away because they were deemed unacceptable by family, culture, religion, and peer group. Your shadow contains not only negative traits, but your greatest creative power, your most authentic desires, your truest genius. For many people, particularly those on spiritual paths, the shadow contains powerful sexuality, fierce creativity, righteous anger, and the capacity to set boundaries. These are not sins. These are not obstacles to spiritual development. These are the repressed sides of your being that are crying out for recognition and integration. When you suppress the feminine in yourself, whether you are a man or a woman, you suppress intuition, receptivity, creativity, embodied pleasure, sensuality, the capacity to receive love, the wisdom of the body. When you suppress the masculine in yourself, you suppress boundaries, clarity, directed will, the capacity to move through the world with confidence, the ability to protect what matters to you. The spiritual path that demands the rejection of either is not leading you toward wholeness. It is leading you toward a diminished, fragmented version of yourself that may feel virtuous but is ultimately disconnected from the full spectrum of human consciousness. This is where conscious sexuality enters the conversation as a gateway to spiritual integration. When you approach sexuality as something shameful, as something to be transcended, as an obstacle to holiness, you are perpetuating the very split that the mistranslation of Selah has embedded in Western consciousness for millennia. But when you begin to see sexuality as an expression of life force, as a manifestation of creative energy, as a means of connecting with another person at the deepest levels of vulnerability and presence, then sexuality becomes spiritual. This is not hedonism. This is not license to pursue desire without consciousness or consent. This is the recognition that desire itself, the yearning to connect, to merge, to feel, to experience the aliveness of the body, is not fundamentally opposed to the sacred. The sacred lives in the body. The divine flows through your senses. God, or the ultimate reality, or the ground of being, or whatever language resonates with your understanding, is not located only in transcendence. It is equally present in immanence, in the material world, in sensory experience, in the body, in desire itself. When you integrate your sexuality as a conscious person, you begin a profound process of psychological and spiritual maturation. You stop seeing desire as an enemy to be vanquished or a weakness to be ashamed of. You recognize desire as information, as guidance from the deeper layers of your psyche about what matters to you, what calls to you, what your authentic self is seeking. In Jungian terms, you begin to engage with your shadow sexually, to bring consciousness to your erotic nature, to acknowledge what turns you on, what excites you, what calls to the most alive parts of yourself. This consciousness, this refusal to hide from your own desire, begins the process of integration. You are no longer split between the public self that appears spiritual or virtuous and the hidden self that hungers and desires. You are becoming one. You are remembering the original wholeness that existed before the separation, before the cultural conditioning, before the religious programming that taught you to hate yourself. This is what the psychological concept of the conjunctio, or the alchemical marriage, really means in both Jungian psychology and spiritual tradition. It is not about romantic love alone, though intimate partnership can be one pathway to experiencing it. It is about the marriage within yourself of all the polarities that consciousness contains, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter, conscious and unconscious, desire and devotion, the mountain of transcendence and the valley of embodied presence. Jung wrote extensively about the conjunctio as the ultimate goal of psychological development, as the sacred marriage between the ego and the self, between the personal consciousness and the deeper self that contains all of you. This marriage cannot happen if you are at war with half of yourself. This marriage cannot happen if you have relegated your sexuality to shame, your body to disgust, your desires to denial. The conjunctio requires that you bring all of yourself, especially the parts you have been taught to despise, into conscious relationship with each other. Many spiritual seekers describe a particular experience that arises at certain points on the path. They notice that as they deepen in meditation, in prayer, in spiritual practice, as they begin to touch the transcendent dimensions of consciousness, they also begin to experience more intense desire, more vivid sexuality, more powerful urges toward embodied connection. This confuses them. They have been taught that spiritual advancement means transcendence of such things. They interpret the intensification of sexual desire as regression, as the spiritual path failing them, as evidence that they are not yet ready for enlightenment. But this is precisely backwards. What is actually happening is that consciousness is awakening throughout your entire being, including the somatic dimensions that had been deadened by repression. As meditation awakens sensitivity in the body, as spiritual practice opens the heart, as consciousness expands, the body wakes up. The senses become more acute. Desire becomes more vivid. This is not a failure. This is the beginning of the integration you have been seeking. The consciousness you cultivate in meditation wants to flow into every dimension of your existence, including sexuality. The love you open to in prayer wants to express itself through your entire being, including physical passion. The presence you discover in silence wants to inhabit every moment, including intimate moments with another person. What you are experiencing is the call to conscious sexuality, to the integration of erotic energy with spiritual energy, to the marriage of eros and spirit within yourself. This is not new. Ancient tantric traditions understood this completely. The yogic paths of Kundalini recognize that sexual energy and spiritual energy are fundamentally the same thing, creative life force flowing through your being. The Taoist traditions of China preserved practices of sexual alchemy, understanding that the fusion of masculine and feminine polarities through conscious sexuality creates and circulates spiritual energy. The medieval Christian mystics spoke in language so erotic and sexual that it has embarrassed later religious authorities, but it was their way of expressing the overwhelming union with the divine. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote about the spiritual marriage in language that is frankly orgasmic. St. John of the Cross called himself the lover of God and wrote poetry that blurs the boundary between spiritual longing and sexual longing because, for him, they were ultimately the same longing. These were not confused saints or spiritually immature practitioners. These were masters of integration, people who had traveled so far into spiritual territory that they could see how false the split between sexuality and spirituality had always been. Now return to the image that the Ethiopian Bible preserves. Adam and Eve are not two hierarchically related beings, one complete and the other derived. They are two manifestations of a single unified consciousness that has differentiated into complementary poles. They are, in the most profound sense, two halves of one being. This is not poetry. This is the deepest truth about human relationship and human consciousness. Every intimate partnership is, at the deepest level, a meeting of two halves seeking to remember each other, seeking to recognize in the other the missing part of themselves. Every sexual union, when entered with consciousness and presence, is an opportunity to merge with the other half, to temporarily transcend the separation, to experience the conjunctio, the sacred marriage, the return to wholeness. This is why sexual union can be so profound, so transformative, so spiritually significant. It is not profane, it is sacred. It is a return, however temporary, to the original unity before the separation, before the division into masculine and feminine, before the fall into duality. When you approach your own sexuality with consciousness, when you stop hiding from your desires and begin to integrate them into your self-understanding, when you recognize your erotic nature as part of your spiritual nature, you enter the path of individuation that Jung described. You begin the long work of making peace with yourself, of bringing the exiled parts of your psyche back into relationship with your conscious self. You begin to recognize that the shadow, everything you have been taught to reject about yourself, contains essential power. You begin to see that wholeness is not achieved by transcending your humanity, but by embracing all of your humanity, your wisdom and your foolishness, your strength and your vulnerability, your spirituality and your sexuality, your capacity to soar and your need to be grounded, your desire to merge and your need to remain differentiated. This is the gift that a correct understanding of Selah offers to modern consciousness. When you know that Eve was created not as a diminished fragment, but as the full other half of Adam's being, you start to see women not as secondary humans derived from males, but as complete whole beings carrying half of the original completeness. More importantly, you start to see yourself as containing both poles. You recognize that the masculine and feminine within you are not opposing forces, but complementary dimensions of your total being. You understand that psychological maturity requires not the victory of one over the other, but the integration of both. You begin to realize that the spiritual path is not about transcendence of your embodied nature, but about bringing consciousness into every dimension of your embodied nature, including sexuality, including desire, including the full spectrum of erotic energy. The journey that Adam begins when he awakens from his deep sleep and sees Eve before him, this is your journey. You too are awakening to the existence of the other half within and without yourself. You too are being called to recognize parts of yourself that have been sleeping in unconsciousness. You too are being invited into a process of reintegration, of bringing together what has been divided, of moving toward the wholeness that was your original condition before the conditioning, before the conditioning, before the religious and cultural programming that taught you to fear and reject the full spectrum of your own being. The path of conscious sexuality is not a detour from spirituality. It is a direct route into it. The acknowledgement of your desires, the acceptance of your body, the integration of your erotic energy, these are not distractions from the spiritual path. They are essential dimensions of it. In the years and centuries to come, as consciousness continues to evolve, as people awaken to the ways that translation, language, and cultural conditioning have shaped their understanding of themselves, the Ethiopian Bible's preservation of the true meaning of Selah will be recognized as one of the most important corrections to Western consciousness. The day when humanity stops seeing women as derived from men, when men stop identifying masculinity with the fullness of human expression, when people recognize that wholeness requires the integration of masculine and feminine in all beings, this is the day when the true creation story will be remembered. And more importantly, this is the day when you will be able to begin the work of remembering your own original wholeness, your own completeness before the splitting, your own path toward the conjunctio, the sacred marriage, the reunification of all that has been divided within you. Everything you are seeking through spirituality, through therapy, through meditation, through intimate relationship, all of it is an attempt to return to wholeness, to recover what was lost in the original division, to bring back into conscious relationship the masculine and feminine principles that Jung recognized as essential to psychological health and spiritual maturity. The Ethiopian Bible has preserved this truth in its faithful rendering of a single Hebrew word. It is time for your consciousness to preserve it too, to hold it close, to let it reshape how you see yourself, other people, and the sacred journey toward integration that defines the human path. Subscribe and activate notifications so you can follow this series as we explore many more dimensions of how Jung's psychology, ancient wisdom, and modern spirituality converge to guide you toward your own wholeness and self-actualization. The path of individuation, as Jung emphasized throughout his life work, is not a destination that you arrive at and complete. It is an ongoing process of becoming, a continuous dialogue with the deeper layers of your being, a perpetual work of integration that spans the entire arc of your life. When you are young, you identify with the persona, the mask you wear for society, the socially acceptable version of yourself that you present to the world. This persona serves a purpose. It allows you to function in social environments, to play roles, to meet expectations. But if you remain identified only with the persona, if you never venture beyond the mask into the depths of who you actually are, then you live a half-life, a surface existence disconnected from your authentic core. The shadow contains everything you have rejected about yourself in order to maintain this persona. For many people, particularly those raised in religious or conservative environments, the shadow contains intense sexuality, powerful anger, fierce independence, sensual pleasure, and the capacity to say no. It contains all the parts of you that were deemed unacceptable, inappropriate, sinful, or dangerous by the authorities who raised you. The longer you deny the shadow, the more it grows in power over you from the unconscious. It begins to act out in ways you don't understand. You find yourself behaving in ways that contradict your conscious values. You experience compulsions, addictions, attractions that you cannot explain. You project your shadow onto others, judging them harshly for the very qualities you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. This is the mechanism of religious fundamentalism, of political extremism, of any ideology that demands the absolute rejection of certain human qualities. The person who is most vehemently opposed to sexuality is often the person whose repressed sexuality is most powerful. The person who condemns anger most harshly is often the person whose rage is most dangerous when it finally erupts. The shadow does not disappear because you deny it. It goes underground, and from that underground place, it runs your life without your knowledge or consent. Integration of the shadow requires courage because it means admitting that you contain qualities you have always despised. It means looking in the mirror and seeing not just the virtuous, spiritual, enlightened version of yourself that you want to be, but also the selfish, lustful, angry, petty version that you have hidden away. This is not pleasant work. It is not comfortable. Many spiritual teachers skip over this dimension of practice entirely, preferring to focus on meditation, transcendence, and the cultivation of positive states of consciousness. But Jung was clear: transcendence without integration is spiritual bypassing. It is a way of avoiding the real work of becoming whole. When you truly integrate the shadow, when you bring consciousness to the parts of yourself you have been hiding from, something remarkable happens. The shadow loses its grip over you. The repressed energy becomes available to your conscious self. Your creativity increases dramatically because you are no longer using enormous amounts of psychic energy to maintain the repression. Your relationships improve because you are no longer unconsciously projecting your shadow onto others. Your sexuality, when integrated, becomes not a source of shame or compulsion, but an authentic expression of your life force and your connection to others. This is what conscious sexuality actually means. It means bringing awareness to your erotic nature, accepting it as part of your humanity, understanding it as energy that can be channeled toward connection, creativity, and spiritual development rather than spent in compulsion and shame. The integration of sexuality into your spiritual practice is not something that happens only in the privacy of intimate relationships. It is a way of being in the world that honors the aliveness of your body, the authenticity of your desires, and the sacred nature of embodied existence. When you walk through the world as someone who has integrated their sexuality, you carry yourself differently. You are more present, you are more alive, you are more magnetic because you are no longer divided against yourself. People feel this presence. They sense that you are integrated, whole, at home in your own skin. This is not arrogance or narcissism. This is simply what wholeness looks like when it walks through the world. The person who is at peace with their own body, their own desires, their own erotic nature, radiates a quality that attracts others, that inspires others, that calls others toward their own integration.